Jesus has been captured by a mob of angry men sent out in the middle of the night to find him and to bring him to an emergency court session of the Jewish Sanhedrin. Now, every one of his disciples have fled except two. Who were they? Who didn't actually flee. Now, they kind of ran, but two of them actually turned around and followed Jesus into Jerusalem. Who were they? Peter and he's actually John, exactly. John he's related to the high priest, and he actually gets allowed into the palace because he's family of some sort to watch. So he comes in, and because he's known by the high priest, he lets him in. While Peter sneaks in, he tries to get as close as he can to see what happens to Jesus. And Jesus is brought to trial. I don't know if I want to ask how many of you have ever gone before a judge or stood there in court. It is not a pleasant thing. This was not an experience that you want anybody to have to go through. I think that's on purpose. I think nobody, I think the justice system, I think prison, jails should be a deterrent. It should not be a time where you actually get all the free food you want, you get all of the education you want, you get all of the activities and exercise you want. I know that they provide all that stuff. They're trying to rehabilitate people. But nobody should ever feel comfortable going before a judge. It ought to be terrifying, all right? So let's look in Mark chapter 14. We're going to pick up in verse 53. And there's only a few more parts here before we're finished with the Gospel of Mark. Mark 14:53. Here's the trial. Mark 14:53, it says this, and the chief priests and all the council sought for, no, I'm at 53, and they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled, with the high priest were assembled, all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes. Now, the main guy in that room was a guy that was titled the high priest. Now, the high priest goes all the way back to a guy named Aaron, who was the brother of Moses. And Aaron was the start of a mediatorship, which means Aaron took care of all the details to make it possible for sinful man to be able to be back and close to God. He handled all the sacrifices. He led worship. He was instrumental in making judgment calls so that when there was disagreements and somebody needed to be judged for doing wrong or whatever, he was the judge. He was the court. He was able to find out, you're wrong, you're right, pay him, or do whatever. So he was a very important person. This was a family line. So you talk about kings. You know, kings try and pass on their kingdom to their firstborn sons, or at least one of their sons. And that's called a dynasty, or that's just called hereditary royalty. But with Aaron, it was emphatic. Only his sons could be high priests. So it was passed from generation to generation. Who was going to be the high priest would be the son of the already current high priest. There were two alive at that time. One had retired. Now, they weren't supposed to do that. But as you well know, people bend the rules all the time. And there were two high priests at the time, a guy named Annas, A-N-N-A-S. Annas was an older guy. He had been high priest. Health had gotten to him. So he stepped away, but he never stepped down. And you'll find that people do that. It's even in politics. They love to hold on to power because there's great power in power. And so his son, a guy named Caiaphas, his full name was Joseph Caiaphas. Caiaphas is the proper high priest, but Annas is in the background telling him, do this. He's like the Godfather, you know, bring him before me, you know. So they both are involved in trapping, judging, and crucifying Jesus. Now, what was the Sanhedrin? Who were these people in the Sanhedrin? It was a very high council. We would call it the High Court. In America, it's called the Supreme Court. Now, it's the High Court of Israel. These men normally met in a chamber in the temple. It had to be in the temple for them to be in full authority, although on occasion they would do it at the palace of the high priest in his own home. It had 71 members. So you had the high priest and then 70 other guys. They were chief priests, elders, and scribes, or what we would call lawyers, top lawyers. Maybe in Ireland we would call them barristers, or senators would be allowed to be part of that. So if we can take this court actually was the Senate. They did judgment, and they also passed laws for normal life in Israel. Now, this was a midnight session. This was a special call, an emergency session, and that was on purpose. If they had called it during the day, there would have been people wondering what's going on, and they had to do it in view, where people were able to watch and to verify that the court was operating according to the law, and so that people could know whether underhanded dealings were being taken advantage of, and that rules were being followed. Now, they chose to have the court when no one else would know about it, and that was very unscriptural. That was very anti-Bible and anti-Jewish. So it's not in the proper place for the court. It's not at the proper time. And we find, verse 54, we find Peter. Peter followed him afar off, even into the palace of the high priest, and he sat with the servants, and he warmed himself at the fire. So it must have been like an Irish April, which is pretty cold, I don't know. But he tries to come in what I call stealth mode. You know what stealth means, don't you? All right, incognito. That's a fun word. And he's wanting no one to recognize him. Now it's the middle of the night, so nobody should recognize him. So he comes and he's warming himself by the fire. But what's the danger with that? That light will reflect off of your face, and somebody's going to recognize him, and they do, don't they? We'll see that next week. But he wants to see what's going to happen to Jesus. I really don't think he can imagine that Jesus is going to be crucified. He knows that, man, this is bad. This is Peter. He knows that these guys are serious. They have, in an underhanded way, they have captured the hero of the story. They've captured the one who is there to save them all. And think about what he's feeling at that moment. I sometimes try to put my feet into the shoes of the people of the Bible, and Peter must have felt absolute defeat. He must have felt like, how can this be happening to the good guy? You understand? If you ever watched a film or you read the story and you watch everything fall apart, and the person who's trying to do right gets in trouble or dies, you're like, wait, this is not supposed to happen. There is something wired in us that wants the good guy to win, don't we? So Peter is watching his hero be so mistreated, and Peter, be so helpless. Do you think Peter do you think he could have just risen up and said, Jesus, I'll be right there. Stay encouraged. I'm going to stand by you. Do you think Peter had it within him to do that? Would you have had it in you to do that? Think of how hard it was for Peter. He's barely there, and he's watching, and he feels immobilized. As his hero is just standing there. Now, verse 55, the high priest is searching for a crime. I think this is so funny because this is very, very helpful for you to learn about law procedures. Verse 55, all the way down to verse 59, it says, and the chief priests and all the council, what's that next word? All right, now here's the point. If you go to court, they can't now say, all right, what has he done? Does anybody have any idea? Bill, I'm going to take you to court. That's why you see people, when the guard will pull them over, you say, what have I done? There's something inside of us that says, what did I do wrong? And if the police says, I don't have to tell you, I'll find out when we go to court. What? That's cruel, wouldn't it be? Now, they can do that in England, and I think they can do that in Ireland, where they can hold you for 7 days without charge. Is that not true? Now, I think that's wrong. I think they ought to have an accusation. They ought to make it clear to you. And in most of free societies, it used to be that way, but it's getting to where everybody's treated as a terrorist. But it says that they sought for a witness against Jesus to put him to death, and they found none. Now, here's the point. They're looking for somebody who can give them a reason to put him to death. Verse 56. For many bear false witness. To bear false witness means they brought forth, they spoke lies against Jesus, but their witness agreed not together. Now that's very important. So if the guys came along and they met Bill, and I'm always going to pick on Bill, and they met Bill and they said, Bill, here's a 50. I need you to go in there and I want you to say this. And then I'll go and T-Row, here's a 20. I want you to go and you say that. When they stood up and they said, Jesus did this, they had to agree perfectly or else their witness was thrown out. And that's important. Because if one says one thing and another says another thing, it's all hearsay. And courts do that to this day. They test the witness. They make sure that the witness matches all the evidence. Verse 57, and there arose a few, and they again bear false witness. They told lies against him, saying, verse 58, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But neither did their witness agree together. So even these guys who had heard Jesus teach and say, now did he say, I will destroy the temple? Did he say that? No, he says, destroy this temple. And he was pointing to what? Himself. But they just heard the word temple, destroy this. He says he's going to destroy the temple. You see how they twisted it? That's why they tell you, if you ever go to court, say nothing, because they will twist it. So the Sanhedrin had done the following. Number one, they had sought to find someone to bribe to betray Jesus. Who was that? Judas. Remember, that already started this court case. They had bribed a man, paid him off to betray Jesus. Secondly, they had wrongly arrested Jesus without any formal declaration of a crime. If you ever are arrested, they should be able to say, you're being arrested for for breaking and entering, or for the murder of so and so. They can't just say, we'll find out what we can pin against you when we get to court. That cannot say that. Third, they made ridiculous accusations. Think about the accusation. Oh, this guy says he's going to destroy the temple and raise it back up. Is that worth dying for? Is that a capital crime? It's a ridiculous. It's like saying, like if I was out, I'm loopy someday, but not this loopy. But if I go and I'm going down the street saying, I can fly, I can fly, I can fly, okay? And then somebody says, this guy ought to go to jail because he claims to be able to fly. That's a ridiculous accusation. And if somebody says, I can rebuild the temple, that's not a reason to put somebody to death. Do you understand what I'm saying? But they're desperate for any accusation. Biblical law presumes all men guilty or innocent in the eyes of man. What's the word? Biblical law presumes everyone is guilty or innocent. Now, are we innocent before God? No. God can always find fault. But before you and me, you don't know me. You don't know my heart. You don't know my motives. You don't know. You may think, oh, they're doing something nefarious, but you better have evidence. People are not God. Judges are not God. So when they have to make a court case against you, they better have evidence, not just a feeling. So you start off, and this is a biblical thing, based upon Jesus, that they should have given him the benefit of the doubt that he is innocent unless they can bring the evidence and prove him guilty. What had the judges already determined before they even brought Jesus in? What had they already decided? He was guilty. What do we call that? Prejudice. Isn't it funny how the world calls Christians prejudice? You're prejudiced against all the other races. And we'll be accused. And yet, the world has always been prejudging of God and of other people, and they're constantly trying to fix themselves. They got a big problem to deal with in their own heart. There are Christians, and we all get where we prejudge before we hear somebody out. Have you ever done that? You just imagine so-and-so has done wrong before you've heard the other side. So they had to have 2 or 3 witnesses agreeing to whatever crime was being done. All of these witnesses were bribed. Every one of them, they were all lying witnesses. There's not one person who said, I've got to bring my story because I'm afraid of Jesus. I think he's going to do harm. I got to tell my story. They're all bribed. They've all been brought in. In the Old Testament, they were called sons of Belial. And when they were cross-examined, thankfully, their testimonies didn't agree, and that's good. All right, God can sometimes confound your witness. What did Jesus say when he said, when you're brought before the court, what did he say? Don't worry about what you're going to say. I will give you words to say at that time if you need to. And he has the power to confound all of the accusations against you. So leave it in God's hands. So in France, and in a lot of other countries, I think I said this last week, in France and a lot of other countries, you are not presumed innocent. What they do is they have what's called a degree of accusation. And if it's a simple accusation, the courts will throw it out. But if it's a serious accusation, Paul Layton is I'm accused. We think he's a murderer. You know what? He, from that moment, has to prove he's not. Can you imagine the burden on you that somebody can accuse you? That goes back to Catholic Europe, where all you had to have was one person who called you a witch, and you had to defend yourself. How do you defend yourself that you're not a witch? But that goes back to Catholic Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales, France, all over. You were guilty just by one accusation, and you had to prove your innocence. No wonder people just stayed Catholic and didn't become born-again Christian, because you lost everything. All they had to do was accuse you of being a heretic, and you lost everything. All right, I'm just showing you, this is where our freedoms came from, the abuse of the only innocent man who's ever lived. So, look in verse 60. So they were searching for a crime. Now they've got one last chance, and that is to get him to self-incriminate. Now, those are fancy words. It means they want to get him to say something that will make him guilty himself. That makes their job very easy. If you watched Iron Man, at the end, Iron Man is standing there, and they're asking, are you Iron Man? And he says, I am. And the whole world goes crazy. Well, here is where the Pharisees are going to ask Jesus, are you the Son of God? Are you the Messiah? And guess what Jesus is going to do? He's going to own up and say, I am. Watch this. Verse 60. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, answerest thou nothing? Are you not going to answer all these accusations? Answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witness against thee? But he held his peace, and he answered nothing. Again the high priest asked him and said unto him, art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed of God? And Jesus said, what 2 words? I am. Wow. So that's the second time. You've got John chapter 9, where Jesus says, I am the Son of God. See, the Muslims will say, where does Jesus ever claim to be God? Right there. If he's the Son of God, he's God. You understand? So, let's see, 62. I am, and ye shall see the Son of Man, which was the Old Testament, Book of Daniel term for the Messiah, sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest rent his clothes and saith, what need we any further witnesses? Now it's kind of humorous. He had no more witnesses. But he says, phew, we don't need any more witnesses. Verse 64, ye have heard the blasphemy. What think ye? And they all condemned him to be guilty of death. So when he was asked, are you the Christ? Are you the Son of the Blessed of God? That was a very extreme view. A lot of people thought the Messiah was just a very powerful man like King David. He was a prophet. He was a priest. He was a king. But he couldn't be God. So there was only an extreme view that he would be the Son of God. So the high priest says, are you the Son of God? Which was like, who would admit to that? And Jesus said, I am. When it comes to the word blasphemy, Blasphemy by definition means to speak evil of God. That's what it means. If I blaspheme God, it's me saying God's a murderer. God is a God of genocide. That's blasphemy. God has a dark side. That's blasphemy. Jesus was married. That's blasphemy. He wasn't interested in women at all. You see how that is? There's blasphemy, and I think these pictures that they portray of Jesus and Mary being in love and stuff, and making Jesus to be queer stuff, that's blasphemy. That's making God evil. Do you understand what I'm saying? That's clearly blasphemy. But they had the idea that blasphemy meant making God a man. And Muslims have problems with that. We have earthly friends, that's fine. That's what you get. To make God a man is blasphemy. And maybe you can understand why. Jews think it is blasphemy to consider that God would ever be a man. But I always ask the Muslims, I have not been able to ask a Jew this in a very long time. When I was in New Jersey, we met Jews all the time. And I asked one question, but I like to ask the Muslims this. I said, can God do anything? And they'll always say yes. I said, then why won't you let him become a man so that he can die? They can't conceive of that. They can't conceive. They think that, well, that's sin for him to become a man. Well, what if he became a man that didn't sin? And all of a sudden now you're understanding the concept of the Messiah. But to the high priest and all them, it was blasphemy. Now, Jesus quotes Daniel chapter 7. Go back to Daniel chapter 7 real quick. Daniel chapter 7 in verse 13. These are all, Daniel's just amazing. He's looking forward at the future, and he doesn't see the first and second coming separate. He sees them all blurred together. And look what he sees in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 13. Daniel says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Messiah. That's what Son of Man means. One like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven and came to the Ancient of Days. That's God. And they brought him near before God. And there was given him dominion to the Son of Man, dominion and glory and a kingdom that all people, Gentiles and Jews, nations and languages, should serve him, should serve the Messiah. His dominion is forever. It's an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom, that which shall not be destroyed. So 13 and 14 is describing what we call the millennial kingdom when Jesus does come back. But he says, I'm that guy. I'm the one that Daniel told you was coming. And at that point, it just blows up inside the mind of the high priest. And I wrote this thought, instant justice. Look at, or instant judgment, verse 65 back there in Mark 14. Verse 64, he says, ye have heard the blasphemy, what think ye? And they all condemned him to be guilty of death. And some began, even before he's taken, they began to spit on him and to cover his face and to buffet him and to say to him, prophesy. And the servants did strike him with the palm of their hands. These juries, these judges, and the members of the Senate, who were jury members of the High Court, began to abuse Jesus. They spit on Jesus. What a humiliating act. I don't know. I've had it happen to me. I mean, would you like somebody to spit on you? I mean, they're not just accidentally sneezing on them. They're spitting on them. They covered Jesus' face. Do you know why they did that? So that he couldn't defend himself. So he couldn't flinch. So they're covering his face with some sort of a sack. And then they began to buffet him. To buffet is a term that means to beat him over and over and over. They are kicking him. They are hitting him. Then they begin to mock him and says, hey, why don't you prophesy? Why don't you be a prophet now and tell us who hit you? What's my name? And then they struck Jesus on the face with the palm of their hands. Now, they were not allowed to hit with the back of the hand. They could only slap him with the palm, whack. But tell me, a grown man slapping you, would that hurt? Now, they could punch, they could kick, they could knock him to the ground, but isn't it nice they couldn't hit him with the back of the hand? Isn't that nice? They really held themselves back. That's just to make you laugh for a moment. But, oh, don't hit him. You got to hit him slap-wise, okay. And these were done by who? The judges, by the Senate, by the High Court. And this was only the beginning of all the trials that Jesus was about to face this night. Mark doesn't record all of them. When you read all 4 Gospels, you find out there are 7 trials. He's transferred back and forth between Pilate and Herod, before Caiaphas and Annas. And he's going back and forth, and every time that he's in a situation, they're mocking him, they are abusing him. These men will end up, in Matthew chapter 27, they will end up influencing the crowd that will gather that morning when Jesus has been abused all night long and then brought by Pilate. And Pilate is going to try to wash his hands of Jesus, and he's going to try to get the crowd to let Jesus go and put Barabbas on the cross. But what do these same senators, judges, priests, religious people, what do? They influence the people to ask for the death of Jesus. Don't trust religion. Don't trust your church to tell you what is right or wrong. That Bible is what opens our eyes to go, phew. Religions, when they get in power, I don't care if they're Baptist or if they're Catholic or they're Protestants, when religions get in power, what do? They abuse. Jesus didn't come to make churches in control of the government. The government has to be controlled. That's why we have democracy. It's a republic, really, but where we elect and get rid of people because they have to earn our trust. They're not automatically elected. But anyway, they will influence that crowd to demand Jesus' death. They will taunt. As you follow along in the crucifixion, Jesus will actually be on the cross. And do you know who comes up to the cross and laughs at him? The very high priest and the judges and the senators. Can you imagine if the Irish Senate came to a courtroom and a criminal has been condemned, and then all of the senators spit on him and mocked him? We would say, boy, that's really bad. That shouldn't be happening. A judge shouldn't do that. Do you understand what I'm saying? In the end, you know what? This group of senators, high court judges, do you know what they end up doing? They can't help bribing. They will bribe the soldiers who had guarded the tomb, and these guys will bribe them to say his disciples came and stole him. Do you understand what I'm saying? These senators, these high court judges, the high priest himself was evil. So there's and it's by the way, it took 1,500 years after this before courts regained credibility in the free world, where we could trust that we got justice in court. I don't believe we've had justice in court for the last 60 or 70 years. I'm talking about proper justice, not that it was a perfect world, but I believe that courts, let me say this, a court must be blind to the people they are judging. Would you agree with that? Do you know, in a lot of courtrooms, you will have a woman, and in one hand she'll have a book, it's the law. And in another hand she'll have what? Scales. And what will be around her face? A blindfold. Meaning that the judges should not ever care about what color you are, where you've been, what your status is in society, how much money you have. They just want evidence, and they make a judgment based on the law. And that has not happened in a long time. They cater to every group that's marginalized or has been hurt. And so they say, oh, you're white, so we must really punish you. And oh, you've been marginalized, we must protect you. And you go, the courts need to be blind. End of story. Judges must judge righteously. It's spoken like 6 or 7 times in the Old Testament. A judge must judge righteously or they are disqualified. They cannot do it politically or based on popularity. You tell me if our TDs are making decisions based on what's right or wrong, or they're making decisions based on popularity. That's how we get lost today, based on, what the people want. They had to actually destroy the Constitution to bring in same-sex marriage and to bring in abortion. A court must protect the accused's rights as highest. Which is more important in the biblical sense of law? The accuser or the accused? Which one, according to God, in our justice system, is more important to protect? The accused. Now, they can be guilty, but you better have good evidence. That's why sometimes you wonder, why did they let him off on a technicality? Because it's weighted to protect the innocent. And you better have good evidence. A court must protect the accused's rights as the highest. That's why we have the right to silence. You do not have to say anything. Somebody accuses you, just keep your mouth shut. If they have evidence, let them bring forth the evidence. But you don't have to defend yourself. And the right to have a defense attorney. Did Jesus have a defense attorney? No, there's nobody who would speak for him. And that was wrong. A court must have absolute agreement of a testimony. No one should be allowed to just keep making up stuff. Can you imagine if you went to court and they kept bringing in people saying, we're going to try these guys and see if we can find something that they agree with about him doing something wrong. No. They have to have evidence, and it must be absolute. A court cannot act on their own conclusions. They have to stay dispassionate. They cannot become passionate about the accused or whatever. And, I feel your pain for the person who's been traumatized. The court has to be dispassionate, and they cannot coerce any confession. What do they say about somebody who's been, picked up and brought to the Garda? You cannot abuse them to make them confess. And yet that's what they were trying to do with Jesus. And lastly, appeals must be allowed. Is there any way that Jesus can appeal his death sentence? No. They've done it all. They settled it. And they're going to bring it before Pilate. And Pilate's going to try to get it out. And they've got it so secured that there's no way that he could ever appeal. And you know what's funny? God knew all this. And God was going to use a wicked system. Watch me. Is our world a wicked world? Is our justice system twisted? Is our media twisted? But you know what? God uses a wicked system to fulfill his will. And through this all, with Jesus being abused, it was for God to be able to allow even man to judge God. And when God allowed mankind to judge the Son of God, he was showing, I will use that to my own benefit, so that when I judge, Satan has tried and hurt him. Man has tried and hurt him. I have tried to hurt him, but in the end, he gave his life. And he willingly went through it all. And you just stand in awe of Jesus as I do and go, nobody ever loved you and me like he did. So I think it's absolutely breathtaking. When he went to trial, he handled it perfectly. So when you're under pressure and you're under stress and you just want to explode, remember Jesus and go, I wonder if God's going to do something marvelous in this situation. So let's pray. Father, as we ponder the crucifixion, we think of all of the abuse that happened to Jesus, but rarely do we step back and see who did the abusing. And it wasn't just religious people. These were legal people. These were smart people. These were powerful people. And they were wrong. And when we allow our society and our justice system to just do things on a whim, and all they're doing is doing things the same old way. And it used to be that judges had to know the gospel. They had to learn law from the Bible, because that's where we got our protections from, our rights from. And I wish more than anything, God, I don't know how much longer we've got here on this earth before the rapture or before we're gone. I don't know how long it's going to be, but if we have any time, I pray we would have a good influence on lawyers and on people who are very smart. And I'm glad to reach anybody, God, this book works in opening the eyes of everybody. And I pray we just sit in awe of what you did for all of society, not just the bottom. And I'm glad you loved us at the bottom, but you love them at the top too. You cried out, Father, forgive them who just crucified him. Those religious leaders. I pray that, God, we would just realize this gospel can fix and change even the laws of the land and make them right. And I pray that we would pray for that. We'd pray for our government. We'd pray for our TDs, believing that you can bring a better change. In Jesus' name, amen.